just so you all know.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. But in Alaska.
All right, now I've provoked one.
Our mics are all live.
Sorry.
All right, so I turn it over to my colleague Anna Versluis.
All right. Thank you very much for your talks, Dr. Ali, Dr. Liverman. If I could start with just some questions that might be in the minds of the audience, of just clarification of some terms and basic ideas here. Dr. Ali, so much of understanding carbon dioxide in the atmosphere requires some understanding of the full carbon cycle and the other places in the Earth system where carbon can be stored. If you wouldn't mind talking about that, and then if, Dr. Liverman, if you could talk a little bit more about the IPCC, what it is and what its function is.
Sure. Well, thank you. The full carbon cycle, the IPCC diagram is this beautiful world, and then it has arrows going every which way, and there's little red numbers, and there's little black numbers, and there's big numbers, but basically there's some CO2 in the air, and plants take CO2 and they make plant. And then all of us take plant and we make animal, or we make poop, or else mushrooms or something take plant, and eventually we take oxygen and plant and we burn it to get the energy and put the CO2 back in the air. And you will see that if you watch CO2 in the air, it goes down in the springtime because so many plants grow. And you'll occasionally meet the person who says, we don't need to worry about human CO2 because look, it goes down in the spring, but it comes up in the fall because the leaves die and they rot, or they get eaten, or they get burned or something. And so there's been this balance. You grow plants, you burn plants, you grow plants, you burn plants, and little tiny bits of that plant have gotten buried without being burned. And that was fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels accumulated over a few 100 million years, and we're burning them over a few 100 years. In some sense, we have a lot of oxygen because we buried that carbon rather than burning it. And so what really happens now is that we are taking this immense warehouse of stored carbon from all of geologic history, and we're putting it back into the atmosphere as fast as we possibly can because we're trying to get the energy. And that was little bits of stored energy that some bacteria or some fungus or some dinosaur didn't eat. And so broadly, we have put a huge perturbation on the carbon cycle by doing with industrial society what bacteria were unable to do.
Thank you.
Oh, well, IPCC and other members of the panel have experience as well, but let me just talk about a few things. First question I'm asked is, how do you get to be an IPCC author? Well, if you're in the US, there's an email that goes around to really anybody who's had money from the National Science Foundation or is connected to what's called the US Global Change Research Program, and they ask for nominations and self-nominations each time a report is scheduled, and they send you the list of chapters, and they say if you would like to nominate or to nominate someone else to be an author, please send in your CV, and you fill out an application form like you would for college, and you try to say why you might be a good author. And in the US case, then many or most of the people who do submit, and if you've had any experience at all, you know that in order to, if you get selected, it's going to sort of mess your life up for 2 to 4 years because it's all voluntary. You don't get paid to be an IPCC author. You get funded to go to meetings, but it's economy class. And so it really is something you do on top of your day job. So a lot of people don't submit for that reason. And then there's a secretariat that sits in Europe, and they select authors, but they select both based on expertise, but also balance of countries. They want, and particularly they've been trying much harder to have more authors from the Global South. But another element is gender balance, and I know Gabrielle's very interested in this too. The first IPCC report in 1990 had 2% women authors, and I think I know all 5 of them. And the latest report is now 38% women authors, so the gender balance is improving. But there's a difference between representation and voice. So we just had a gender task force for the last year for IPCC that I was the rapporteur before, and we did a survey of IPCC authors, men and women, and many women said, well, it was nice to be in the room, but I couldn't get a word in edgeways. Sometimes because they weren't fluent in English, or they felt other microaggressions, so there's some work to be done there. But anyway, the Bureau selects the authors. You get this letter saying you've been selected as either the lead for the chapter or a lead author, and you get sent the schedule of meetings. First meeting, you get together, you decide what's going to be in your chapter, you assign responsibility. You've got to read hundreds of papers, because an IPCC report is not your latest opinion or your personal research project. You're assessing all of the work that's been done since the last report. So it's basically like a big lit review. I got my students to help me because it was so overwhelming. And then you meet over the course of a few years. There is, however, you're writing away, and you have to go basically through 3 rounds of review, at least for the 1.5 report. The first is a scientific review, when any scientist on the planet, or anybody who thinks they're a scientist, can sign up to comment on the draft chapters, and people submit comments over a period of time, and then they're all sent to the authors. There's a second round of review that's the government review, when it's sent to all the government agencies around the world, and they all submit comments. And then, so for the 1.5 report, we have 42,000 comments to respond to, and you have to respond to every single one. The funniest ones are the ones you get from scientists saying, but you didn't cite my paper. and then you have to either cite it or say, we didn't have enough space, thank you. Yes, it was a wonderful paper, but we can't talk about it. But that's a lot of work. And then the final review is where, you write a big report, and then there's a summary for policymakers that is the sort of condensed version of the report, the executive summary. That one, you go to a plenary with government delegates, and it's like a climate negotiation almost, 20 pages or so, and that they put every line that you've written up on the screen, and any country can disagree and ask you to defend what you said. The best defense is, this is what the scientific literature says, but there are countries that really try to stop the whole process. So for the 1.5 report in Korea, it actually wasn't the US that caused us difficulties. They were reasonably constructive, but don't tell their bosses. And the country that was very difficult was Saudi Arabia. They questioned every single sentence. But you negotiate over the course of a week. They've just finished the summary for policymakers negotiation for the ICE report. And for the last 48 to 72 hours, you don't get any sleep because you always run out of time. It's 24/7 negotiations. And by the time it actually gets approved, everybody sort of bursts into tears. They're so exhausted, delegates and scientists. At least that was my experience. I was bawling my eyes out. But I don't know if other people might have I don't know. I made it sound like fun. But it's really hard work. And there are some other fundamental problems with IPCC that maybe other people can talk about. But it's also amazing how much weight it does carry. I was personally shocked at how much interest there was in the 1.5 report and how much impact it's had. And I'm still trying to understand why we had such an impact. But that was long, sorry.
What other experience?
I think it had a lot of impact because it was a great report. The Royal Society were pulling people if we should react to this, I should say something. And I said ahead of it, it's going to be pretty boring because 1.5 is going to be better than 2, but we know that. But then what came out was really impressive. It was really attacking the problem from every angle and looking at pathways. And there was so much questions that I thought would be really hard to answer. So it was a real big milestone. For me, one of the most fascinating things about IPCC are the plenaries, even though they are difficult. So it is a room this size, maybe,
Just like this.
with delegations from all countries that participate, over 100 usually, and many come with several members. And so every single sentence that is in the summary for policymakers is discussed and adopted. So the summary for policymakers, as it is published, has been adopted by all the countries that are involved, including the United States. So if some people now say, we don't think this is actually a problem, or we don't think it's caused by humans or something, it's actually been accepted to have been caused by humans. So I find that a bit interesting that on the one hand it can be adopted, and on the other hand then the politicians go around and change their mind about it. But the negotiations about adopting sentences are interesting. As a scientist, I was anxious about it, and was wondering how much it would twist the science or something. But actually, in most cases, the suggestions were good ones. They often were more clear. So we were talking too technically, and the delegates helped us to clarify this. So it often improved clarity, language. Some good questions were asked. Some countries have the countries that are very interested in making it sound. Making climate change sound like not such a big problem are balanced by countries that have an interest in making it sound like a big problem. So if you have one country, and it was already named as one that generally says you can't be sure about that, possibly, then you have a whole bunch of other countries saying, no, we actually think, if anything, you are being too conservative here. And so it's a process that is really fascinating, and I'm still fascinated and mystified by that it works. To arrive at a report at the end, and Richard has been
right. So a country will put up their flag here.
Oh,
like
that's why you're doing
this. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So a country that has something to say will put it up, and they would say, "Well, our country respectfully believes that that and should be an or." Or large should be above average, or outstanding should be large, or and every word is Smith. And sometimes it is for clarity. Often it is for clarity. There are some very, very good writers involved. But sometimes it is to bury the lead, as a journalist would say.
Or weaken the report.
Or weaken the report. So it is a fascinating negotiation. And sometimes some of the more interesting things do, by the time they have been wordsmithed, come out as less interesting. And there's actually been a fair amount of recent scholarship. Michael Oppenheimer has been behind a lot of this, that social scientists looking at what the IPCC does. And by and large, they said, well, it's really, really good. It does its job. It gets the answers out. It is consistent with the underlying literature. But there is a built-in tendency to understate the largest damages and the largest dangers. And it is a complicated issue. I'm sure we will see more social science on this. But what they've found is that there is some tendency of this whole process to take the sort of, we could have a disaster, and make it look manageable.
Mike's not going to say anything.
You have too much to say about the IPCC, Dr. Hume. Questions from other panelists for Dr. Ali and Dr. Liverman, or comments on what they said?
Yeah. Well, with IPCC, just very briefly, I know it's hard for Indigenous people to be part of the larger plenary, for sure. And I've been involved in 3 COP meetings where we do our best to get our voices heard through side events. But not everybody attends them. They're smaller, and although people became much more interested in the later times, it is tough to get any kind of strong language in there that deals with human rights of Indigenous peoples around the world. And as you know, if you're working on the ground in that area, you know, one year we take a few steps forward and it's in there, the language is in there. The following year, it's taken out. So, you know, there's always this cumbersome process of trying to keep the kind of strong language that is required to deal with Indigenous peoples' issues and human rights of people. So that's been the experience that we've had, because in other UN negotiations, it was easier to get on the floor and to speak, but it's only the heads of Dell that are allowed to speak at these kinds of events at the COP meetings, so that's one. But I wanted to ask Dr. Ali if you could, I know that a lot of your work was in Greenland. I don't know if you're up to speed on some of the current things that are happening there, but the world rarely knows and have heard of the 2 tsunamis that have happened there in recent years now that have taken lives of people. And I wondered if you know a little bit about that, what's happened. One of them with a mountain that slid into the ocean, and as we know, Inuit live on the coast of we're coastal people because we're marine mammal hunters. And it killed several people. We hardly heard about that a few years ago. And just last week, there was another from the calving of a glacier, I believe it was, that again took the lives of a few people. But we never hear these stories of Greenland until your president wants to buy it. You know? But Greenland, as you know, is huge in terms of the land sheet being, the ice sheet being on land and what that's going to do with high sea level rise. So, right. Do you see someday, I think you mentioned that in one of your how is it going to take a huge chunk of Greenland for a huge disaster in this world? Do you see that coming?
So several points there. Yeah, your points about gaining indigenous knowledge in the actions the IPCC, maybe Diana wants to add to. This is important. Okay, the local issues when ice is melting, whether it be in the Andes, whether it be around Greenland, whether it be in the Himalaya, there are local dangers, and these are usually put in the local category, so they don't get as much coverage as you might think. The hillside is held together with permafrost. The ice in the permafrost thaws, the hillside falls off. And this has happened in Alaska, it's happened in Greenland. If you're in the way of it, it's a very bad thing. Mm-hmm. Big icebergs falling off the front. In the Andes, Jeff is down here, he's an expert on this. The glacier retreats, and the glacier had advanced and it surrounds itself with a big pile of rocks we call moraine. The glacier retreats, and now you have a dam, which is the moraine with a lake behind it. And no one would ever make a dam for a lake out of loose rocks. And so usually it fills with sediment before it collapses and floods the valley down below, but sometimes it collapses before it fills with sediment, and then it floods the valley below and people die. So the sort of local issues of big changes, almost always when you have a big change in the climate, you will have big changes in sediment, big changes in hillsides, and people are in the way. And so this is one of those many issues that come up. We are cautiously optimistic that Greenland will keep these mostly local, and it will be a very big thing for people who live there, but there won't be enough fall off of Greenland falling off of Greenland will be slow enough that we will see the sea level rise coming. We are a little worried about pieces of Antarctica that might break faster.
Mm-hmm. Just a comment on Indigenous Voices and the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. There are a couple of people involved in chapters, but one of the interesting things is when we did the survey of IPCC authors and the task force was discussing the survey design, I wanted to ask a question about indigeneity, not just gender, but other intersectional issues. And members of the task force from a lot of countries said that's not an appropriate question in our country. And it's because in many countries, people either see themselves as completely indigenous or the sort of way people talk about it. And I fought to have a question because I wanted to know whether people would say I'm speaking for indigenous people, and we couldn't get the question on the survey. But I do know that in certain chapters, even if Indigenous Voices are not selected as lead authors, the next, at least, Impact and Vulnerability and Adaptation report from the IPCC, there are quite a lot of contributing authors who are from indigenous communities or identify as indigenous. But, you know, if you think IPCC does a bad job with women, I think they do an even worse job with indigenous voices.
Because we were quite successful with the Arctic climate impact assessment.
Yes, yeah, that's a good
We
example.
had lead authors, we had partnerships, we had all of that, which was
It can be
pioneering
done.
work. It can be done.
Maybe another question?
Well, let me say that it was, both your presentations were so interesting and so informative. But I had a question for you, Professor Ali. One reads different things about the impact of climate change on seismic activity. Do you have any views on that?
Right. Climate change and seismic activity, the biggest place that this could affect it would be that melting ice unloads the land moves, and it may break. There's probably a little of this. The landslides and the calving that you were talking about also makes seismic activity. There's also a little bit, melting ice tends to stimulate volcanoes in places where there is active volcanism. So as the ice melts on Iceland, they get eruptions. And this could also happen. You worry about some of the big peaks, very large mountains that are very large volcanoes that are losing their ice. They're being unloaded. Unloading favors melt. It favors the melt coming out. It favors landslides.
But don't we want some volcanic eruptions to cool the climate?
Well, not if you're living next to it. Right? So in my gut feeling is that all of these, compared to making the tropics too hot for unprotected humans, these are in the noise. But if you're living next to the volcano, if you're living next to the hillside when it landslides on you, it really matters. And so these are, it is easy from a global perspective to dismiss the local, but the local is hugely important. And again, more or less, anything you change really fast, you're likely to have unintended consequences, and this would be one.
Dr. Hume.
Can I just pick up something Diana was talking about and maybe just ask you to elaborate a little? So you very nicely presented the relationship between climate goals and the SDGs and how the 1.5 report from the IPCC tackled that and drew out both synergies and trade-offs. One particular trade-off I'm interested in is what you call the just transition for energy. And you gave the example from Nevada, I think it was Nevada, of communities whose livelihoods and cultures have been framed and brought up around, in this case, coal, but other fossils. But how does this play out, and did the IPCC look at larger scale challenges to this? So countries whose economies and who've not just got small communities, but very large numbers of people who are whose livelihoods are linked to the fossil industry. And whether it's in India or in Australia or in South Africa or in China, if one moves away from coal, how does one put into place policies and processes that are just for those people affected?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really important question. I mean, if we look at why Saudi Arabia was opposing the 1.5 report, it's because its power, its economy, and its workers are dependent very much on fossil fuels. So you can see their political position relating to that, as well as a number of other countries. I mean, Australia, for example, their politics are rising and falling on the coal versus climate debate. But what I would say is I was actually one of the people arguing, we need to talk more about this in the report. We need to talk about the losers from climate action, not just, people who are affected by an adaptation project, but people who will lose jobs because of the things that we're recommending here. And there isn't a lot of literature, interestingly. So we were trying to find papers on, the Middle East economies, and also where people are documenting, because there are countries in the Middle East that are starting to make the transition. They're investing massively in renewables, not just as the alternative to fossil fuels, but also because they're vulnerable themselves. They have very low-lying landscapes. So But one of the things you're constrained by in IPCC is this idea that we'll use the peer-reviewed literature rather than the media or anecdotes. So I think that we need a big research effort on the just transitions and really looking at how they work, not writing about them in a sort of a utopian way, but so that we can actually look at how we subsidize those transitions, how we compensate people, how we retrain people, so that we, and I mean, that's part of the debate about the Green New Deal, is how do we actually make that happen? And how do we make it? I mean, I can tell a positive story about a school in Tucson, but how do you scale these up? Especially when so many people in the world are underemployed and unemployed and underpaid. So I think you ask a really important question. That
and there's a role maybe for, I mean, there are different dimensions to that, but here's a role for historians to actually look at other examples from the past in different places in the world where transitions have been made away from certain livelihoods towards others, either by accident or by design. For example, what happened in China with the Three Gorges Dam. This was, the reasons for the Three Gorges Dam are multiple, but hydropower is renewable power, and yet hundreds of thousands of Chinese were uprooted. Or, again, looking at the example in the UK, probably some of the most violent civil disturbances that Britain has had in my lifetime occurred because large numbers of working class people in mining communities faced the end of their industry under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. And it wasn't just their livelihood, it was their whole way of life.
Their culture.
And this was, for over 18 months, there was violence on the streets of Britain. So there are examples from history that scholars and academics could bring into the foreground to help us think, how do we better put in place policies that can mitigate against some of these disturbance effects?
Yeah, but I think we mustn't pretend that everybody's going to win. I mean, we have to say, yes, some people will perceive themselves as losing, but it's for the much greater benefit. And we've also done that before.
But if I may add to what you were saying, I mean, it's actually the case that even in the late 18th, early 19th century, the transition from water power to steam power, you had the same kinds of disturbances, especially in England. A lot of, the whole history of Chartism, etc., being tied up with those transitions. So it seems quite likely that it's not going to be, certainly not going to be a smooth process.
Dr. Liverman, who gets to decide who loses?
Well, usually it's going to be politicians, because every policy they pass or don't pass has a redistributive effect. I mean, it's very rare that you put into a place an energy policy or an emissions policy that doesn't have some distributional impacts, but consumers can make choices about who wins and who loses. If you choose renewables or you choose to be a vegetarian, you're making a consumer choice that will benefit some and not others. And most of us are not thinking about the emissions of every single choice we make. I mean, I have had moments in the supermarket where I panic about buying green beans from Chile or something because I think about the emissions, but how many of us are making those everyday choices about... But then I think, I literally, probably because I read too much about this stuff, I think, I'm not going to buy that vegetable because of the emissions. And then I think about, but what about the workers that will lose their jobs, the whole fair trade thing? So
don't go grocery shopping with Diana Liverman. An audience question for Dr. Ali. You've studied the ice record of past climates, and one of the things you've learned is that there have been abrupt climate changes. Can you talk about when do you think the first catastrophic abrupt change, like wholesale methane release, will begin to appear?
Right, it's a great question. We are cautiously optimistic that there will not be giant methane belches, right? So abrupt change is real. I chaired a committee for the National Academy of Sciences in 2002 when we did the physics of this, and then Jim White chaired one in 2013, and we revisited. And what we found was that there is some chance that there will be physical surprises that are big. But other than West Antarctica collapsing and greatly raising sea level, we didn't find a lot of evidence for physical systems having tipping points. There are time smoothers on the methane, and there are safety valves on the methane, and so the odds are pretty good that there will not be giant methane belches. It would be a slow feedback, not a fast run for the hills you're doomed to win. And West Antarctica was the one exception. As we went from physical systems to biological systems, we said there's probably more tipping points. You get to, it's dry, it's hot, it burns, and some other ecosystem comes back. And I don't want to go too far watching Brazil right now, but this idea of maybe you burn something and it doesn't grow back in a sufficiently bad drought in a warming world is real. And then we sort of thought, and this was a broad committee that had been convened, that probably the biggest place to look for tipping points is in human systems. And at what point do we say, we're in this together, we're going to pull together and solve the problem? And at what point do we say, I hate you and I'm going to shoot you? And we have done both of those in history, and we can do both of those in the future. And at what point are we in this together versus walls and guns and bombs? And so we were sort of worried that as you go from physical to biological to human, you get more and more possibilities of people going across a transition and changing into something really different and surprising that could be really expensive and really bad.
Thank you. Question for Dr. Liverman. It seems to me that, especially following from Dr. Ghosh's talk earlier today, where he contrasted the migrant discourse with the sort of what he called the technocrat or maybe scientific discourse, that your work with the IPCC, you've been very much part of the technocratic and scientific discourse, but yet you've also done a lot of field work where you're talking to regular people in their homes and at their jobs. Can you just talk about the discourses that you might hear? Are they different? Are they the same? Do they work against each other? Is there synergy?
That's an interesting question, which I haven't thought about. I think now the discussions can be very similar. And it's partly because most of my work the last few years is focusing on how we can adapt to climate change, which is sort of saying that I shifted from mitigation, thinking we wouldn't do it, that we were going to have to live in a warmer world. And so a lot of what I'm looking at is how we can live in a warmer world. And the discussions amongst the researchers and the policymakers are not very different from the discussions with farmers or my neighbors about what are we going to do with the risk of heat waves. And if I ask my neighbor, she said we need cooling centers and we need warnings, we need to shift the school day. And that's pretty much what you would find a researcher or a policymaker talking about. So we have a new mayor coming in Tucson, and she's really worried about climate adaptation, particularly for disadvantaged populations. And she convened a group of us, some activists, some community folks, some people from the university, and I don't think there was any sort of hierarchy of knowledge. We were all just trying to come up with a list of what needs to be done and where can we get the resources to help people. Probably the most interesting question that came up was when I raised the idea of surviving peak temperature. So how do we get the Tucson community through what I think will be warmer and then hopefully cooler? And then we had a really interesting discussion about who survives peak temperature and how do we help people. But no, so I'd say on adaptation, we're all sort of worrying and saying about the same thing. And even when you talk to people about, local people about, okay, who's going to benefit from this adaptation and who's going to lose, we're all saying the same thing for the most part.
An audience question for Dr. Alley. Why do the climate models tend to underestimate the climate change? Yeah. And you maybe...
Well, we have a world expert down the line here, and maybe you'd like to chime in a moment. I suspect that partially it is because we live within the range of what we've seen, and that there are certain things, especially related to clouds, that we may not have seen as extreme a world as we're headed to. So there's, and I hope you'll chime in on this, but there's been a little research recently that is suggestive that as it gets warmer, that we will see fairly large changes in clouds. One piece in particular from Tapio Schneider's group at Caltech, we rely on clouds over the Pacific to reflect the sun and keep us cool. They are maintained in part by radiation to space. When we get more CO2, the radiation to space doesn't work well. The clouds heat up, they disappear. We switch into a warmer world.
No, that's not good.
And so there is a possibility we've missed something on cloud feedbacks. There also is, if we make it warm, a lot of ice will melt, but it takes a while. So the warming in short terms happens in a world in which some energy is going into melting ice and the ice is still melting, reflecting the sun. But eventually that ice will be gone and then it will get warmer. So partially there's a difference in time scales, that the models are looking at the short-term changes, but the paleoclimate record is looking at the long term. And partly we may have missed something in the clouds that will amplify a little bit, because we keep seeing this evidence in the warm climates of large climate change.
For the more recent period, the models seem to be relatively well on track to reproduce the historical changes and the changes over the last millennium or so, but I think I agree that
which is absolutely true. They're very good.
Yes. The paleoclimatic record throws up some questions of changes that could be larger over very much longer timescales. I think what we are really bad at also is thinking about risk in terms of what Richard showed very nicely with his drunk driver, of events that maybe are not quite as likely. There are maybe more the extreme outcomes if like all the effects in the atmosphere conspire, like the clouds, to make it a bit worse than we expect, then a lot of things could get a lot worse very quickly, and so this kind of even not so very likely outcome could carry such big risks that we really should be thinking about it very seriously, even if it's not the most likely outcome. And I think the separation between what is the most likely thing to happen and what is the thing that could happen and could be very, very dangerous is how to discuss about this is something we find very difficult, and I think humans are not good in risk anyway. Every time my airplane starts jiggling, I'm thinking I'm going to die, and every time I drive down the highway, I think I'm perfectly safe because I'm driving. So I think humans are terrible at thinking about risk.
Thank you, Dr. Alley.
Oh, do we have time? Oh.
Go ahead.
1 minute.
Just on the sort of models and risk and tipping points, either Gabby or Richard, in the way you understand how we model the Earth system, what possibility do you think we have of having early warnings of particular types of tipping points? Or will they just happen? And if there's an early warning, what are we actually looking for?
Right. So
we need David Keith here for that as well.
Yeah, so the formalistic physics often see critical slowing. There are certain things in some systems that give you a hint that it's coming. And so we might have warning of some of these. Whether we are actionable, whether we could see it coming in time to change our decisions in ways to affect the climate in ways to avoid the tipping point. That probably requires more warning than we're likely to get. So my personal opinion is that the sort of, we see that we're about to hit something really bad, and that means we should change our international relations and our energy system in ways that slow down the warming so we don't hit that bad thing.
We've already hit the bad thing.
So my gut feeling is that thinking of this as a risk management problem is really wise. When you know that the iceberg is in front of the Titanic, it may be too late.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, presenters and panelists.
So I want to observe that there are many, many very wonderful questions that are coming in, and obviously we are scratching the very slightest surface of them. Please, as you're leaving and as you're walking to a workshop, talk with the person that's leaving in front of you about one of your questions, and carry this discussion out into those workshops, which are taking place in the two buildings closest to us here, Beck Hall and the Student Center, and then in the newest building on campus, the fabulous new Nobel Hall. There will be a map here that shows those in a moment. There we go, thank you. And then please take everything with you when you leave right now, because you won't be back here till tomorrow morning, and we do come in and clean. A reminder that there are 2 art openings as well as a ceremonial horse dressing ceremony after the workshops today. And then this evening there is an event involving poetry and music, which is not a recreational activity. It is a continuation of the questions that are happening here. So we will reconvene here tomorrow morning, but have a wonderful time at these workshops.